Chapter 2. Schedules ought to be followed and not questioned, Inez said, with no small amount of seriousness. I will have Patty Ann put a full schedule for the children's next week on the desk in your room. Patty Ann? Maggie asked, wanting not to miss even the smallest detail. Mrs. Ayer's personal secretary. She handles all of Mrs. Ayer's personal affairs, including children issues. Children issues? They sounded like line items on a checklist. For tonight's purposes, baths are at 7:30 sharp. Bedtime is 8. It would be best if you stayed in your room or at least in the children's wing during your time here. I do not recommend going anywhere else other than down these stairs to the kitchen or the entryway stairs to the outside if need be. The last nanny was fired for being where she wasn't supposed to be. Fear pounced on her, but she yanked it back. Oh, that shouldn't be a problem. Good. Well, unless there are any questions, it's time for me to start dinner. The United States Navy couldn't have sounded any more regimented. I think I'll be fine. Like a drill sergeant, Inez turned on her heel and started down the stairs that led right into the kitchen. With a sigh of exasperated relief, Maggie turned the other direction. Welcome to the life of the rich and famous. She went into the playroom. Peter was now sitting quietly on the floor playing with the blocks. Isabella was lying on the little couch sucking her thumb. Big brown eyes stared at Maggie, wary but hopeful. "Ah, sweetie girl, are you tired?" Maggie walked over and picked her up, soft pink ruffled dress and all. "What do you say we sit here in the chair and read a book? How would that be?" She carried the child to the wooden rocking chair and sat down. Reaching to the side, she pulled up the first book she came to, Sleeping Beauty. With the barest of pushes of her toe, she started the chair rocking gently. Isabella tucked her head closer to Maggie, who wrapped her spirit around the baby in her lap. Once upon a time. Calling Dallas wasn't all that unusual for Keith. In fact, he usually found some excuse to bridge the gap between them at least 3 or 4 times during the week. So why placing that call on Thursday night felt so strange? He couldn't exactly tell. She would be back home in a couple of weeks, and in truth, he was looking forward to seeing her again. When her phone clicked, he smiled as he always did when they stole a few minutes away from life to be together. He settled deeper into the soft cream couch. "Hey, babe, how's it going?" Dinner had been interesting. Baths weren't much better. Not because the children were bad or hard to manage. Much the opposite. As Maggie sat on her massive, preternaturally high 4-poster queen bed, she leaned her head first one way, then the other, to work out the kinks. It wasn't something she could put into actual words. But both children did not seem so much children as miniature adults. They were quiet. Very quiet, especially Peter. He seemed so circumspect about every move he made, like when they entered the formal dining room and he had walked first to his mother to give her a kiss on the cheek, and then to his father, whom he shook hands with. It was like watching someone meet the Queen. Isabella was more demonstrative, but measurably so. Maggie wrapped her arms around her knees as she thought about holding the little girl while they rocked, read, and then took a nap together. Here there was no yelling, no danger of physical harm, and yet there was no joy either. Even at Mrs. Malinowski's, there were always ropes to jump and games to play. Here, games seemed to be relegated to Peter being one-on-one with a few blocks in the corner. Maggie shook her head and pursed her lips together. Pulling the heavy, deep red comforter, dotted with thousands of tiny white flowers entwined with green vine, from her legs, she slid off the bed and onto her knees. The plush cream carpeting felt like clouds. Propping her hands on the edge of the bed, she bent her head and let the words in her heart become wings of prayer. "Dear Lord, I know these kids have everything except what they really need. Please give me the strength and the wisdom to bring your joy and love into their lives. Bind Satan from this house and let him not get a foothold here. Cast him out into the darkness and fill this house with your light, your love, your grace, and your peace. Amen. Oh, and keep Mrs. Mal and all her kids safe for me. Rain your saving love into the hearts of every child who is alone, afraid, or in need tonight. I ask all these things in your name. Amen. When she stood, she considered getting into bed, but thought better of it. Instead, she padded quietly to the door. She cracked it open and checked both ways. Slipping into the hallway, she tiptoed to the door next to hers, Isabella's. As it had the first time, the sheer size of the room brought a shake of her head. She walked silently to the baby bed wrapped in big, pink ruffles and peered over the side. Peaceful and soft, Isabella lay, sucking her thumb, eyes closed and cooing softly. "Good night, little one. God bless you." Maggie laid her hand on the little curls and said a quick prayer. Then she turned and tiptoed out into the nightlight-illuminated hallway and to the room across the way. In the junior bed, with ball and bat wallpaper ringing the room around him, lay Peter. He seemed at first to be sleeping, but then she noticed his little eyes twitching ever so slightly. Puzzled, she bent closer to him and watched carefully. It took several seconds, but his eyes became slits. "Peter," she said softly, in case he really was asleep. At that, he came full awake. "Hey, sweetheart, you're not asleep yet?" Solemnly, he shook his head, his soft brown eyes pleading with her not to be mad. She smiled gently. "Tell you what, why don't we say our prayers together? Maybe that will help." Kneeling next to his bed, she took hold of his little hand and closed her eyes. "Dear Jesus, be with Peter tonight. Give him peace. Help him to fall asleep. Send your saints and angels to guard him through the night until the dawning of the morning light. This we ask in your name. Amen." A grateful smile traced through Peter's eyes and across his face. "Better?" she asked, gazing at him seriously. Up and down went the little head. "Good." She pulled the covers around him and tucked them in. When she stood, she ran her hand over his blonde hair. "Now, you get some sleep and let Jesus take care of everything else, 'kay?" "'Kay." "I'm right down the hall if you need anything." He nodded, his eyes already starting to look heavy and laden with sleep. "Good night, sweet prince," she said, and with one more brush of his hair, she left him to his dreams. As stupid as it sounded, Keith wondered the next day how Maggie was getting by. He checked on her car on his way to work, and it was indeed still in the barn. Impressive crossed his mind. Of course, it couldn't last. Vivian was impossible with the help, and his father was more apt to fire than to listen. Trying to dismiss her from his thoughts, Keith entered the stables and strode to the office in the back. "Mornin'." Ike Jones, the trainer, looked up and his face fell in concern. "You're up early. You feeling okay?" "I'm fine. I just figured if we've only got till May to get Dragnet going, we'd better get to work." "Hodges called about the feed," Ike said. "It should be here tomorrow. Something about hauling regs upstate." "We got enough to cover it?" "Yeah, but we need to keep a watch on them. They did this last-minute thing to us 2 months ago. I don't want to make a habit out of cutting it this close." "Got it." Keith yanked on his work gloves. "Did you get that fence fixed yesterday?" "Fence?" Ike asked incredulously. "I've been buried here under this mountain of paperwork for a week. What do you think?" Keith smiled with a slight tease on the edges. "I'll let you worry about the paperwork. Leave the real work to me." "Ha ha." But Ike didn't really protest. Don't hurt yourself getting your head through the door." This time, Keith laughed outright. "No worries there. That's why they made the barn doors so wide." Ike, too, joined in the laughter. Then his gaze fell to the desk. "Oh, and sometime today you need to take these invoices up to the main house. Your dad needs them for the accountants." "Invoices? Be still my beating heart." "Yeah, yours or mine," Ike said with more seriousness this time. "And with all due respect, I'd rather it be yours." Keith yanked the nail bags from the side wall. "Such loyalty. You won't take a bullet for me?" "A bullet, yes. Your father, on the other hand?" With a shake of his head, Keith attached the belt to his waist. "You're the definition of bravery, Ike." "Bravery around here gets people killed or fired, neither of which I really need right now." Keith started toward the door and was halfway out of it when Ike yelled, "Hey, invoices." Some excitement in life just couldn't be avoided. He stepped back to the trainer's desk and took the stack of papers. "Okay, but if I don't come back, it's your fault." "Better my fault than my head," and Keith ducked out. His father was bad. There was no doubt about it. Everyone knew it, and they all lived a life in barely disguised fear. But really, he wasn't all that bad. At least he hadn't been when Keith's mother was still alive. The sadness that always accompanied thoughts of her drifted over him. Pushing it back, he loaded the tools he needed into the bright red Dodge extended cab and climbed in. That was the one lesson he had learned with precision from his father: the great therapeutic benefits of good old-fashioned hard work. It had taken her most of the morning to find it, but with careful examination, Maggie had indeed carved out one whole hour in which nothing else was planned for the children. In the morning, it was dance class for Isabella and art for Peter. Then lunch in the breakfast nook. Even that detail was noted in the schedule. In fact, everything was noted down to the minute, including the 10 minutes of walking in the garden from 1 o'clock to 10 after. However, after the walk, and before nap time, which was also clearly spelled out, there it was, a whole blessed hour with not one thing scheduled. She had seen the enormous redwood playhouse in the backyard from the window in the playroom. Bending down to their level, she let her eyes go wide. "What do you say, before nap time, we go out in the playhouse and read some stories?"
"Stories!"
Isabella squealed excitedly. "Shh," Peter immediately warned, and the fear was evident. "No, it's okay, Peter," Maggie said, taking his hand. "Isabella's just happy. Aren't you happy?"
"I don't want to go."
Sullen and afraid, he looked like a trapped animal. "Really? Why not?" His gaze dropped to the carpet.
"I don't want to get dirty. We'll get dirty if we go outside."
"Oh." She sounded like she understood, although she really didn't. "Well, I'll tell you what. We'll find some clothes that we don't have to worry about a little dirt. How would that be?" Peter still didn't look convinced, but Maggie started about finding the clothes despite his reluctance. It took 15 minutes of their precious hour, but she got them ready, and with Isabella in one arm, and Peter's hand tucked securely in her other hand, they went out to the playhouse in the backyard. Crud. The invoices still lay on the seat. Really and truly, Keith didn't have time for this, but he knew it was time that had to be made. Turning the pickup up the side road, he bypassed the stables and headed to the main house. Jeffrey was out front mowing, and Keith waved at him with a lift of his hand. "Just get this done and get back to work." He climbed the front steps 2 at a time and entered without announcing his presence. Everything was quiet, not a sound anywhere. He wondered for a moment where Maggie and the kids were. Probably at some lesson of some kind. There was never a shortage of lessons with Vivian at the helm. Quietly, he made his way down to his father's office at the end of the hallway. He was 1 second from knocking when he heard the voices from beyond the door, which was open a fraction of an inch. It took him a minute of listening to decide who was in there and whether or not he should knock. By the time he decided, knocking was obviously less than prudent. "I can't believe you didn't notice this on her records," his father said. "That's not inconsequential, you know." "I know, Conrad. Believe me, I know. If I would have noticed it, I would never have even called her in the first place. But you know how desperate I've been for someone. I thought Alicia was the answer, but then she quit before she ever showed up. This was the only application I had left." "You should know better, Viv. We can't have just anybody coming in this house. There are records and information, not to mention the money and the jewelry. Someone with her background? You just never know. How can we trust someone like that?" "I get it, Conrad. Really, I do. But we're leaving Monday. We've had this cruise scheduled for 6 months. If I fire her now, there's no way I'll have someone else by then. I don't want to miss this trip. We haven't been anywhere, just the two of us, since Izzy was born." "I don't know. Leaving her here for a whole week with no one to look after the place. I don't like the sound of that." As if he hadn't been standing there for 5 minutes, Keith knocked on the door. "Dad?" He pushed the door open, and his father and Vivian both looked up like they had been caught. "Oh, sorry, Vivian. I didn't realize you were here." He held up the receipts. "I just needed to drop these off." Nonchalantly, he stepped into the room and handed the receipts over to his father. Then he turned to go, but stopped. "Oh, we're keeping an eye on Hodges. They've been jerking us around on the feed supply, just so you know." "Okay." Keith could feel the intense conversation going on between the two of them without hearing any of it. "Well, that's it. I'll just get—" "You know, Keith." His father stood, still looking at Vivian. Finally, he put his full gaze on his son. "We're going on vacation come Monday, and we're needing someone to keep watch over things here while we're gone." "Oh, sure thing," he nodded. "I'll make sure everything stays on an even keel, just like always." Once again, he turned for the door, and this time he had his hand actually on the knob. No," his father said, stopping him. "I don't think you understand." When Keith turned, his father was looking at Vivian, obviously trying to get her to give up the crazy idea. Finally, his father relented and stepped around the desk. "We want you to stay up here in the main house and keep an eye on Peter and Isabella." "Pete and Izzy? Isn't that why you hired Maggie?" "Well, yes." The battle to figure out a plausible lie was clear. "But she doesn't even know her way around yet. I'd hate to dump all of this on her and take off." Keith considered this a moment, and then shrugged. "Well, I don't mind if you don't." Anger flashed to the surface of his father's demeanor. "Of course I don't mind. What's that supposed to mean?" "It was a joke, Dad. You know, a joke. Ha ha." But no one was laughing. Vivian turned to him. "But you'll do it then?" Again, Keith shrugged. "What the heck, sure." Careful down, careful down." Maggie stood at the foot of the ladder that stretched up into the playhouse above. Reading was fun, but their hour was gone. She was going to have to hurry to get them down for naps. Already, Isabella was huddled into Maggie's shoulder, sucking her thumb. Helping Peter down the last 2 steps, Maggie took his hand, and they started for the house. That house had a way of getting bigger every time she looked at it. She wondered how many rooms there actually were. Many more than she would ever be privy to visiting, she was sure. She pushed those thoughts to the back of her mind and stepped up to the door, which she opened and held for Peter. "Come on, we'd better get your sister down for her nap." They crossed through the living room and were 2 steps into the entryway when from the other hallway the hired hand, who seemed to be following her around, met them at the stairs. "Well, hey there," he said, and his easy smile was never far behind. "Hi." She could feel her glasses sliding down on her nose, but she didn't have enough hands to push them back up. He stepped over to her and ran his hand down Isabella's back. "Tired little girl."
"We went in the playhouse,"
Peter said at Maggie's knee, and she looked down at him in surprise. The hired hand sat down on his heel so he was on Peter's level. "I bet that was lots of fun. You being a good boy for Maggie?" Peter nodded, and Maggie fought not to notice the strength in the hand the guy reached out to ruffle Peter's hair. "Good deal. Keep it up, sport." Noise from down the hallway brought him to his feet, and Maggie's attention snapped that direction. Side by side, Mr. and Mrs. Ayer walked in. "Oh, Maggie, good. I'm glad we caught you," Mrs. Ayer said. As Maggie turned to them, she felt Peter cowering behind her knee. Balance was a challenge, what with Isabella now breathing softly on her chest and Peter's arm wrapped around her leg. However, she anchored herself to the floor to keep from being buffeted by the two little ones. "We are going out of town next week," Mrs. Ayer said, "and we've asked Keith to keep an eye on the place." For a split second, Maggie had the name with a question mark after it on her tongue, but before she could ask, the hired hand smiled at her. Her brain surged into gear. Oh. She fought to smile as 6,000 different emotions cracked over her. "Great." "I promise I won't be too much of a pain," he said, and when he smiled at her, she couldn't stop her own from coming for real. Her gaze fell to the side. When she brought it up again, it was to look at Mrs. Ayer. "Just give Patty Ann the schedule you want for the kids. I'm sure we'll be fine." She wanted to say more. Her heart was jumping all over until in the swirl of emotions, she thought she might do something really stupid. "Well, I'd better get these two upstairs for their nap. We're late." Turning for the stairs carefully, she took hold of Peter's hand. "Come on, Peter. You can help me put baby Bella down." Keith couldn't help but watch the three of them all the way up the stairs. She was such a natural with the kids, not demanding or overbearing like the last 3 nannies they'd suffered through. No, Maggie had a genuine caring in her eyes. It was clear this wasn't just a job for her. Depression tamped down over his heart when he remembered it couldn't last. Certainly not with her less than perfect clothes and manner, and definitely not now that they had found whatever they'd found in her background. He wondered about that as she disappeared around the curve of the staircase to the level above. "Well, then it's settled," his father said, dragging Keith's attention back to reality. "We leave for Miami Monday morning, and we'll be back, when?" "The next Tuesday," Vivian said as she folded her arms across her chest. She stared up the stairs. "I hate to leave her alone like this." "Don't worry about it, Viv," Keith said confidently. "I've got it covered."
Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel so you never miss a second of the story.
This has been Deep in the Heart, written by Staci Stallings. Narrated by Becky Dowdy of Brave Hearts Audiobook Productions. Copyright 2010 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings.